Thanks, Philip, for the introduction, and to Jason for inviting me. Actually, Jason, I must congratulate you for your, I think, your insight in actually putting Patrick before me, because Patrick has made my life very easy. In fact, my job in part will be just to reinforce some of the things that Richard touched on. But I think that I'm hoping that I will give you a perspective based on real life experience of what we do, even though things might not seem to be commercially viable, but they're really important lessons. So my focus is really to speak about the what are the economic and health benefits of protecting intellectual property. I think it's very important. And I think the perception out there often is that we tend to view IP protection as something that is intended to enrich individuals or whoever is behind it. But in fact, as I'll show you from the example of what we actually do ourselves, where there is no obvious commercial bias, that in fact IP is an important vehicle in actually protecting the poor and improving access to medicines. All right, again, Patrick did a pretty good job of explaining this. So from the perspective of finding new medicines, the first question we always ask ourselves, any company involved in this business, is to ask the question, what is the unmet medical need? When I talk about unmet medical need, first of all, generic medications are not your solution to unmet medical needs. And I'll give you just two scenarios to illustrate this point. You would be in a situation where we have existing infections, even cancer, for example, that over time, certain cancers develop resistance to certain types of drugs, for example. Or if it's infectious disease, we know TB, for example, has been around for a very long time. But we have new forms of TB, not just TB that's resistant to 2 or 3 drugs, but even TB that is totally resistant to existing medications. And then, of course, on the other side of the coin is that we have new diseases that have come up, different types of cancers, new types of cancers. HIV/AIDS is a new infection that started in the 80s. So we're presented with a scenario where even established infections have evolved into developed mechanisms which require us to provide new innovative solutions to keep ahead of the game. But secondly, we have new infections and new diseases that we have to think about innovating. So that's very important to keep in mind. And when you talk about generic medications, remember this, that generic medication, once upon a time, was an innovative medicine. It had to be discovered. And somebody has to put investment in that. And all it takes is for the cancer that you're treating a particular generic medication with to develop resistance, for that drug to be rendered useless, and that infection impossible to treat. So I'm giving you a perspective to understand that you can really look at IP from many, many different perspectives. So the information that's provided here, I think is really giving you the picture that, first of all, because we're dealing with these things that are constantly threatening our very existence and survival, we have to continue innovating, research and development. Okay? It's necessary, but it's expensive. And I think that I don't need to convince you, unless you are in this business of doing it, that you can never appreciate what it takes to get a product, one product, onto the market, at least in this space. And I'll come back to that. So it takes a very long time, and it's very expensive. Of course, this you do. And of course, this must always be a partnership. Governments alone cannot solve this problem. So the private sector as well is an important player in this. So it's really a public-private partnership. So I won't labor the point here, but really suffices to say this business of creating innovative solutions takes a very long time and is expensive. All right. what about patents? Okay, why do you need patents on a new drug? Okay, the first point is a no-brainer. Is that, first of all, it provides exclusivity to the owner, so that in case of any infringement, one has recourse to some legal process. That we just don't do things like we have a banana republic or we are in the jungle, the law of the jungle. It doesn't apply to human beings or shouldn't apply to human beings. So we need IP so that any kind of infringement can be addressed legally, not through the barrel of the gun or any other means. Okay? That's the first thing. But in the context of health, this business of getting a drug from discovery to the market, as I said earlier on the previous slide, is a very, very expensive process. And I'll give you a sense of, even just on a small scale of what we do, what we have to spend every year to keep our 2 programs going, just at the very, very early stages of the process, gives you a sense of what goes into this. So if you look at this diagram that's on your screen, from your left to your right, you see some kind of funnel where you start with a lot of molecules that you evaluate. And this is not making up numbers. This is something from a real experience of not just the industry, but real experience of what we have found ourselves doing this here in South Africa. It takes a lot of effort, a lot of time, but also you have to go through a lot of molecules to come up with one that is successful. Okay, so the typical numbers are you start with thousands, and the attrition rate is extremely high if you go from the left to the right. Many things don't see the day of light. They fail at some stage in the process. And somebody has to pay for those failures. So when you think about what ends up in a business, what ends up as a blockbuster drug, for example, that blockbuster drug has to pay for the many failures along the way. So we say, to discover a medicine, you have to kiss many frogs before you meet the prince. So this is really, I think, a very important message for people to understand that we don't here even talk about things that failed. And if you don't run a business as a business, the people will be unemployed. And ultimately, it's a patient that's going to suffer. So this business really requires investment, but also, of course, investments mean that there need to be incentives for that investment to be made. Incentives not just on the part of the investor, but incentives on the part of people that want to labor and put effort into finding solutions to those problems. I don't want to labor the message that's on this slide. I think Patrick did a wonderful job of really capturing some of the real economic benefits of actually operating in an environment where IP laws exist and IP is protected. And I think these statistics here, we can talk about many things, but, and I will show you perhaps from our own example of how in our small little operation that we've been able to create not just direct jobs, but also indirect jobs and induced jobs. So maybe if you don't like the Americans, maybe I won't quote these statistics, just in case you think I'm biased. But the principle here is really important, that where is an environment where IP is respected and protected, that really leads to economic benefits, which are really measurable. In fact, some of them are really unquantifiable. There are things that you can measure directly or indirectly, but also there are things that you can't even begin to measure. That's the principle I think I'm trying to highlight, and I'll show you before I finish off just one example. The health impact, it's a no-brainer. It's a no-brainer. We've seen massive progress thanks to science and technology and incentives in respecting intellectual property. The benefits to patients out there, whether they're cancer patients or HIV patients. We've seen in malaria, for example, over the last 5-10 years, a reduction in the number of people that die from the disease every year, from 1 million to 500,000. It's thanks to investments in research and development with an appropriate IP environment, fueling that innovation going forward. So again, I don't really want to overstate the point here, but I think Patrick made very good points here. But my last 2-3 slides are really about ourselves. Now I'm speaking about somebody who is in this business as an African in South Africa doing this. What does it really mean? What does it take to do this? All right, so, so the US is an example that I showed you previously. But what about Africa? Can this work, really? Can this work? And can we see the same benefits that we see in the US or the UK or Europe in terms of when you have a strong IP environment and all the benefits, and I think from Patrick's presentation, you saw the many, many positive correlations between strong IP and many other factors, including economic prosperity, job creation, et cetera, et cetera. All right, so our typical example is, I am from the University of Cape Town Drug Discovery and Development Center, which you call H3D. We've been going for the last 5-6 years, since about 2016. And we have focused, when we started, just deliberately because we had to start from somewhere. This is not something that this continent or this country has known before. We have no history, long history, or track record of discovering medicines. We can do things in the clinic and do clinical trials. We can do things in the lab. But this chasm, the gap that exists between the clinic and the laboratory is something we're trying to bridge through this. And we focused on just starting somewhere because it's not just about the disease here. It's about how do we begin a journey, a process, having learned lessons from people who've done it. How do we build the necessary infrastructure, the critical mass of people that we need to sustain this operation? And how do we contribute to solving not our health problems? These are human problems. We in Africa have benefited from other people's innovations. And I think we have a responsibility to contribute to solving those problems as well. They are not African problems. They are human problems. Okay. So we focused on malaria because we had to start somewhere. Start slow, start somewhere, and build by brick. We now expanded the programs in about 2013 on a bigger scale to TB. And now, last year, we started looking at resistant bacterial infections. So commercially, of course, it's a no-brainer. There are no serious commercial returns, and I emphasize serious. I think sometimes this thing is really exaggerated. But let's, for the sake of argument, accept that there are no serious incentives to really focus on doing malaria and TB research from a commercial perspective. However, what's important is that we are really working in this space to contribute to solving health problems that predominantly affects the poor majority. Okay. Now, why is IP then an issue? Because we're trying to do something that is for the common good, or for the benefit of the poor. And the answer, of course, is a resounding yes. And I'll tell you just in a couple of minutes. But first of all, when you secure IP and manage it, even if you are going to develop a drug for malaria, so let's say you are Medicines for Malaria Venture, MMV, based out of Geneva, a public-private partnership. The mandate of MMV is to deliver a malaria treatment that costs less than $1 per treatment. Less than $1 per treatment. If MMV or the partners working to ensure that product gets to the market and costs less than $1 per treatment, if they haven't secured the IP, not for them to make profits, but to shepherd the IP. Where now IP doesn't necessarily become a right, it becomes a responsibility. So without IP, you cannot down the line interest a commercial partner, for example, a pharma company, to manufacture the drug. And I will show off in my final next slide just to show how manufacturing and the research and development is a constant interaction between the two. But unless you've secured intellectual property, you're not going to be able to, people want to know who owns the IP, not because they want to make money out of it, because they don't want to be obstructed in the noble cause of making that medicine available to the patient, improving access. So if you don't have IP, you have no control over what happens to your drug. So that's the first point, is that it provides freedom to operate on the part of the commercialization partner. Without IP, there is no freedom to operate. Anybody can do it, and it'll be free for all. And that's not acceptable, because then that actually compromises quality and puts the patient at risk. Someone has to take responsibility for putting a product onto the market and guarantee quality, that they can be held accountable if something goes wrong. But if you have a free-for-all type of situation, Nobody is going to take responsibility for what happens if something goes wrong in the market. So I think that's really is important. Apart from shepherding the innovation through to commercialization, it really also ensures that the patients have access, that they are not encumbered by some other things that nothing to do with getting drugs onto the market for patients to access. That's why IP is important. Securing and managing IP, even for things like malaria or TB, where there are no obvious commercial returns, is really important because it's really in the interest of the patient so that there's no obstacles to getting that drug to market. And I think my final slide, I will skip this just very quickly. This is something we've done in our center. We started about 5-6 years ago, and I'm just trying to give you a sense of what it takes. We are a very small operation located within a university environment, University of Cape Town. But our annual budget to run 1 or 2 discovery programs is 60 million rand per annum. So somebody has to give us that money. In fact, about 80% of it is foreign direct investment, and the rest is what comes from local sources. Again, showing you that when people see the IP environment is going to be respected, even with their mandate of ensuring, if you are MMV, that the malaria medicine at the end of the day should not cost more than $1 per treatment. And so MMV, because they understand that this environment here respects intellectual property, they will happily bring those projects to us. And on the back of that, we are contributing to creating high-level jobs. I used to have 4 postdoctoral fellows in 2011, and the group is over 50 now. High-level jobs, I mean, forget about indirect jobs, forget about induced jobs. These are direct jobs. Jobs that would not otherwise have been there because there isn't a comparable industry to absorb those people in positions. Okay, but the point is that the eventual market access to whatever we do is really going to be enabled by the IP system that should exist to protect the poor patients. My final slide is simply this. Okay, I was talking about the interaction between the research and development value chain and the manufacturing value chain. And just as a disclaimer, this is not actually what is happening. I'm just showing you one possibility of what could happen if, for example, in the case of malaria programs, if the Industrial Development Corporation or anybody wanted to invest in manufacturing of whatever discoveries that we make from the beginning, think about that even when you transition from the lab, before you enter clinical trials, everything we do in the lab is laboratory scale. And when you start going into phase 1, you have to think about how are you going to manufacture enough material for the clinical trial. Okay? The phase 1 clinical trial is 20 to 100 people, so you need maybe at least 5 kilograms of material. You go to phase 2, you need 100 and 500 people, so you need kilograms and kilograms of material. If you go to phase 3, it's thousands of patients, so you need tons of material. But who is going to manufacture that? Who is going to get the right to manufacture that, unless you've secured the intellectual property? That's how then that manufacturer is going to have access to that intellectual property and have the legal right to manufacture that product, either for clinical trials or eventually when the product becomes available to patients. So this is my final slide, but I think the message really is that the intellectual property is also a responsibility. You cannot just file a patent and sit on it. You have a responsibility, apart from the fact that the clock starts ticking when you file a patent. But more importantly, the patient needs to have access to that product. And therefore, yes, it's intellectual property rights, but it's also intellectual property responsibility. Thank you very much.